I want to thank Craftsy for sponsoring today's video. Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is Haley with Haley Stitches, and today I'm going to show you how to make a super easy layer cake quilt. This pattern uses no background fabric, so all you need is one layer cake. You can download a copy of the free pattern using the link in the description of my video. It'll be free for the next week, and after that you can get it for just $2 in my shop. So grab your layer cake and let's get started. These are all the supplies you'll need for today's project. You'll need a layer cake. I'm using the fabric line called So Obsessed by Art Gallery Fabrics. You'll also need a square quilting ruler and a long quilting ruler, a cutting mat, a rotary cutter, some sort of marking utensil, and matching thread. Everything I'm using in today's video will be linked in the description below. Before we start cutting our fabric and assembling our blocks, we need to sort our fabric. So we're going to sort it into two piles, one light pile and one dark pile. My fabric doesn't have a ton of contrast, so I'm just going to do my best to separate them into colors. But if you have a more contrasting fabric, it'll be a little bit easier to do this. And then you'll end up with 18 lights, 18 darks, and then there'll be 6 squares left over since we're only using 36 squares in this project. From there, I'm going to put them into piles of 9. So you'll have 9 light, 9 dark, and we're going to keep these piles paired together to assemble our blocks. Before we start the block assembly, I want to talk about the sponsor of today's video. This video is sponsored by Craftsy. Craftsy is your go-to online resource for all things creative. Craftsy is an amazing community where makers like us can dive into endless inspiration and advance our skills no matter what level we're at. Craftsy has over 2,000 classes across tons of creative categories, including quilting, sewing, and knitting. I recently watched Finish It, Borders, Backing, Binding, and Beyond by Kelly Ashton, where I picked up some great tips on adding labels and hanging sleeves to quilts. The class was super thorough, and I walked away feeling like I knew exactly what to do when I want to add a label or a hanging sleeve to a quilt. I loved how Kelly taught how to add a temporary or a permanent hanging sleeve. It was a total game changer. If you're like me and want to keep learning new techniques or just find some inspiration, Craftsy has you covered. Their friendly, expert instructors make learning so easy with step-by-step video tutorials. You can go at your own pace, and you can even download helpful resources from each class to make following along and practicing new techniques even easier. The first 1,000 of my subscribers who click the link in the description of my video will get access to a full year of Craftsy Premium for just $1.49. This offer is valid for new members only, so if you want to give Craftsy a try, now is the time. This offer is perfect for anyone who wants to take their quilting and creativity to the next level. Happy quilting, and I'll see you there at Craftsy. We'll take our first set of lights and darks and pair them together to make half square triangles. You're going to pair the light squares and the dark squares to make the half square triangles. So the first step is to draw a diagonal line on the back of your lighter square. So I'm using my long quilting ruler to do this and my marking utensil. And then we're going to pair the squares right sides together. And after we layer them on top of each other, we're going to take it to our sewing machine and sew a 1/4 inch away on each side of that marked line. So on the right side and the left side of the marked line, you'll sew. This is what it looks like after you've sewn the blocks together, and then we're going to cut it in half along that marked line. I'm using my rotary cutter and long quilting ruler to line it up on that marked line, and then I'll cut it and you'll end up with 2 identical half square triangles. Press to the darker side of the fabric, and then it's time to trim. So we're going to trim these down a little bit smaller than you normally would for a half square triangle, and that's just so all of the blocks are the same size in this quilt. So we are going to trim this down to 8.5 inches. Normally with these size fabric, you would trim it to 9.5 inches, but for this quilt, we're going to do 8.5. So I'm going to make sure that diagonal line on my ruler and that diagonal line on the half square triangle are lined up. And then I'm going to cut on 2 sides, the right and the top. And there's a little bit of fabric waste with this method, but those tiny strips aren't really enough for me to save. So then I'm going to rotate my block and finish trimming it down to 8.5 inches, making sure that diagonal line is lined up with my ruler. And then you'll repeat that process for the second block, and you'll end up with 2 identical 8.5 inch half square triangles. So we'll finish going through the rest of our pile of 8 lights and 8 darks to get a total of 18 half square triangles. Now we're going to take the remainder of our fabric and cut them so that we can assemble our stripe blocks. But I want to show you something before we start cutting these pre-cuts. So for pre-cut fabric, they have pinked edges and this helps them not unravel. But you can see there's a peak of the pinked edge and then the valley. And this is a layer cake, so they're 10 inches. Depending on what the manufacturer is, it'll measure 10 inches from peak to peak or valley to valley. So that's just something to pay attention to since we're cutting all of these 10-inch squares into 2.5-inch strips. So you do have to be pretty exact on your measurements for this. So that's why it's important to measure your layer cake squares before you get started. So to cut this, I'm going to cut it in half on that 5-inch measurement, and then I'm going to stack them and cut them in half again on that 2.5-inch measurement. And each of these 10-inch squares will give us 4 2.5-inch squares. You're going to cut all of the remaining squares into 2.5-inch strips. And then we're going to choose 4 strips. You kind of want them to be contrasting, like 2 lights and 2 darks. And again, this layer cake isn't great at showing the contrasting fabric, but you get the idea. So we're going to sew 4 of these together, and then we are going to trim these into 8.5-inch blocks. Since the 2.5-inch strips should measure 8.5 inches when they're all sewn together, you'll only have to trim the edges. And my camera died there on that last cut, so I didn't get to show you that, but it ended up measuring 8.5 inches. So you'll cut and assemble the remainder of your squares into these stripe blocks. You'll end up with a total of 18 half square triangles and 18 stripe blocks. So here I've laid out my rows, and I'm just making sure there's not 2 that are too close together next to each other, and we're going to be alternating the half square triangles and the stripe blocks. So I laid everything out, put them into rows, and then I've labeled the rows using these alphabetes and clover clips. And I'll show you how to assemble row 1. So this is going to alternate starting with the striped block first and then the half square triangle next, so on and so on all the way down. And each row will have a total of 6 blocks in it. And you can turn these stripe blocks if you want to. I just had them up and down in the pattern, but really you can customize this however you want to do it. So we'll sew this row together following this pattern to get our first row. And then for the second row, it's exactly the same assembly method. The only difference is we're starting with our half square triangle this time, and then we'll do our stripe block next. So that's going to give us a nice alternating pattern throughout the quilt. And all of the odd rows are assembled the same way, and the even rows are assembled the same way. And here we have row 1 on top and row 2 on the bottom, and you can see how the stripe blocks are alternating and then the half square triangles are alternating. So that'll give us that good pattern that we want in the quilt. You'll press all of the odd rows to the right and the even rows to the left. This will help everything nest when we assemble the entire quilt together. So after all of the blocks are assembled into rows and then the rows are sewn together into your quilt top, this is what the final quilt will look like. It ends up being 48 inches square, which is a great size for a child or a small throw, and you can easily add a border or even sashing to this quilt to customize the size a little bit if you want to. Grab the free pattern by using the link in the description of this video, and if you're watching this a little bit later, you can grab it for just $2 in my shop. If you want another fun layer cake quilt, check out this video. I'll see you there.